So I recently went through something no father should ever have to explain. Something so humiliating, so surreal, that for a moment I thought maybe I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. Imagine standing on your own porch in front of your family's cabin with flashing red and blue lights cutting through the pines and two police cruisers crunching to a stop like you were some kind of criminal. That's what happened to me. And the person who orchestrated the entire circus, the president of an HOA. A woman who didn't own a single inch of my land, but acted as if she ruled the world. It started quietly enough. The lake was calm that evening, the kind of calm that makes you forget there's chaos anywhere else. I had just placed my son's old guitar on its stand, the wood glowing in the orange light of sunset. My son, Leo, had just deployed overseas. He told me not to worry about his things. It's just stuff, Dad. But I couldn't let his memories sit in storage where they didn't belong. That guitar, his yearbooks, his ridiculous lava lamp, those weren't just things. They were pieces of him, and I wanted them safe here in the cabin my grandfather built with his own hands. It was supposed to be peaceful. It was supposed to give me comfort while he was gone. Instead, it turned into a war. The sirens hit first, sharp, shrieking, echoing across the still water until my stomach dropped. By the time I stepped outside, police cars were already pulling in, their headlights stabbing through the dusk. And there she was, waiting like she had staged the whole performance, Karen. Clipboard in hand, arms folded across her chest, her face frozen in that sour little smile she wore when she thought she'd won. She didn't even try to hide it. She pointed at me, then at the cabin, mouthing words I didn't need to hear to know they were dripping with poison. The younger officer got out first, his hand resting on his holster. My heart hammered against my ribs as I raised my hand slightly, trying to show I wasn't a threat. The older officer, mustache, tired eyes, the kind of man who'd seen too many small-town dramas, walked toward me calm but firm. "Sir, I'm Officer Miller. We received a call about a break-in and theft in progress." His words hit me like a slap. A break-in, here, at my family's cabin. The place that had been ours for 3 generations. The idea was so absurd it left me stumbling over my own words. "Officer, this is my family's cabin. I'm just moving my son's things in. He's Army, deployed overseas. I'm just keeping them safe." I pointed back toward the truck, still loaded with boxes. My voice cracked with frustration. But from the corner of my eye, I could see Karen whispering to the younger cop, shaking her head like she was describing a dangerous criminal. She was a master of fake concern, her whole act a snake coiling, waiting to strike. The humiliation burned deeper with every second. To her, this was power. To me, it was betrayal. My son was serving his country, and I was being treated like a thief for protecting his memories. The officer's eyes stayed flat, professional. "The complainant says this property falls under the Cypress Creek Estates HOA," he said, nodding toward Karen. "She claims you have no right to be here." That's when the rage finally clawed up my throat. "The HOA? Officer, my family built this cabin 60 years ago. We've never been part of any HOA. My voice shook, not with fear, but with anger. Still, I knew anger wouldn't save me. Proof would. I told him my wallet was inside, my license sitting right there on the kitchen table. He nodded, sent the younger officer with me, and I retrieved it. My name, Tom Coleman, was right there on the ID. He ran it, confirmed who I was. And for a moment, I thought the nightmare was over, but Karen wasn't done. She marched over with her laminated map, tapping it like it was the law of the land. "See," she said with her syrupy voice, "it's within our jurisdiction." I watched as Officer Miller compared her map to the county plat map on his tablet. He zoomed in, traced the lines with his finger, studied it like the truth was buried between pixels, and the silence stretched, broken only by crickets and the hum of his cruiser. I could see the smug victory rising in Karen's eyes. She was waiting for the cuffs, waiting to see me hauled off like some common trespasser. And then Miller's expression shifted. He cleared his throat, looked straight at her, and said words I'll never forget. "Ma'am, I think we have a problem." The air went still. Karen's smug grin flickered, confusion creeping in. And me, for the first time that night, I felt the tiniest sliver of hope. Everyone held their breath. The only sound was the buzz of insects in the trees and the low crackle of police radios. Karen's smirk twitched at the corners, but she held it, chin lifted like a queen waiting for the gavel to drop. She thought her clipboard was stronger than the truth. She thought a laminated lie could erase 60 years of my family's history. Officer Miller studied the digital county map again. Then slowly he raised his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice colder now, "this cabin is not within your HOA's jurisdiction. In fact," he walked a few steps closer, holding the tablet up so she could see, "your boundary line ends 50 feet before his driveway even begins." Karen blinked, once, twice, her face drained of color before rushing back into a blotchy red. That's absurd, she spat, her voice suddenly sharp. Our documents are perfectly clear. That digital map must be wrong. The younger cop shifted, his suspicion crumbling into unease. Miller didn't flinch. This is the county's official record, he said. This is the legal boundary. You filed a 911 call claiming a break-in on a property you have zero authority over. That's a false report, ma'am. His words hung in the air like a hammer ready to fall. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated, but instead I felt hollow, humiliated. The lights dimmed, the officers left, and the night pressed in around me. Karen's SUV vanished down the gravel road, kicking up a bitter trail of dust. But as I stood on the porch with my son's guitar gleaming in the corner behind me, I knew this wasn't finished. I had won the battle, yes, but the war had just begun. The next morning, a heavy silence filled the cabin. My body felt wrung out like I'd lived through a storm, and then I found it. A letter tucked beneath my windshield wiper, embossed with the Cypress Creek Estates logo. $500 fine for unauthorized storage of personal effects impacting the community's visual corridor. Another $100 fine for trespassing on HOA common land. The common land, she meant? A strip of weeds between my driveway and the county road. It was nonsense. Vindictive nonsense. My jaw clenched as I held the paper. That's when Grant appeared, strolling down the path like a guardian angel in a t-shirt that read, "I weld, therefore I am." He carried 2 root beers and his fisherman gnome, Old Salty, under one arm. "Figured you could use a cold one," he said, handing me a bottle. His eyes caught the letter. He whistled low. "She's not done, is she?" I shook my head. "She's doubling down." Grant leaned against the porch post, his expression tightening. "Tom, you need to understand something. Karen doesn't back off when she's wrong. She attacks harder. She'll paper you with fines, drag you into court, tie you in knots with lawyers. That's her game." I swallowed the root beer, its fizz sharp against the acid rising in my throat. "Why, what's the point of all this?" Grant looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "You ever hear of the Millers?" The name meant nothing to me. I shook my head. "They were an old couple," he began, "lived at the end of Willow Lane, sweet folks. Their house was never in the HOA, been in their family forever, but it sat right on the border of Cypress Creek. Karen decided it ruined the entry aesthetic. So she annexed it, or pretended to, started sending them fines for shutters that were the wrong color, for cracks in the driveway, for roses she said were unruly. They were in their 80s, Tom. They fought, showed her their deed, their survey, didn't matter. She buried them in paperwork, threatened liens, lawyers, foreclosure. They cracked under the pressure, sold their home for pennies and moved in with their daughter." My stomach turned cold. I saw Leo's face in my mind, his grin when he played that guitar, his proud, nervous salute before deployment. I clenched the fine notice in my fist. "She ran them out." Grant nodded, his voice rough. "She preys on weakness, and now she sees you as vulnerable, your boy deployed, your attention divided. She's not just after fines. She wants control. She wants land." Something inside me hardened. The anger I'd felt the night before wasn't enough anymore. This wasn't about me. It wasn't even about Leo's things. It was about every person Karen had steamrolled under her obsession with power. When I told Sarah what had happened, the flashing lights, the letter, Grant's story about the Millers, her face grew pale, her hands curling into fists. My wife is the gentlest soul I know, but when it comes to family, she's unmovable. "She did this to an elderly couple," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with fury. "And now she's doing it to us while Leo's serving overseas." Her eyes met mine. "We will not be bullied out of our home." Her words lit the fuse. The very next morning, I drove to the county record's office. The building smelled like dust and paper, the kind of place where time itself feels thick. I pored over plat maps, deeds, annexations going back decades. Our cabin's boundaries were clear as daylight, drawn in 1958, never changed, untouched by any HOA claim. Exactly what Officer Miller had confirmed. But when I looked up the Millers' property, my blood ran cold. There it was, their original deed outside the HOA boundaries. Then a decade later, a new survey map filed, redrawing the line, swallowing their home into Cypress Creek. Attached was a declaration of annexation signed by the board, and the person who prepared and submitted it, the board's secretary at the time, Karen Peters. I stared at the papers, bile rising in my throat. She hadn't just bullied the Millers with fines. She had engineered a fraudulent annexation. She had forged her own empire, one false map at a time. And when I flipped to the notary's signature, my chest went ice cold. Witness, Robert Peters, her husband, a real estate agent, a notary public. This wasn't just Karen's crusade. This was a family business. I copied everything, every map, every deed, every signature. The evidence weighed heavy in my hands as I stepped into the sunlight outside. This wasn't HOA drama anymore. This was fraud, conspiracy, crime. And for the first time in my life, I realized I was holding a weapon that could bring the Queen of Cypress Creek to her knees. The documents burned in my hands like they carried their own heat. Fraud, conspiracy, a map redrawn not by law but by ambition, and a husband who stamped it with his notary seal like it was nothing more than a real estate deal. I sat in my truck outside the county office, staring at the copies spread across the passenger seat, and I knew one thing: this wasn't about fines anymore. This was war. But wars aren't fought alone. That night I laid everything out on the kitchen table for Sarah. The pages stretched from one end to the other, before and after maps, the fraudulent declaration of annexation, Karen's name scrawled across official minutes like a scar. Sarah's eyes scanned line after line, her face growing tighter, paler, until finally she whispered. She had Bob notarize it. She used her own husband to back her fraud. Her words hit me like a bell. This wasn't just abuse of power, this was collusion. And suddenly I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. If I turned this over to the authorities, maybe justice would come, but slowly, buried in bureaucracy, hidden behind closed doors, people would never know the truth. The fear would stay. Karen would still haunt that neighborhood, even if the law eventually caught up. I was caught between justice and vengeance, and the line blurred. I didn't want just a legal win. I wanted her power broken. Sarah reached across the table, her hand finding mine. Her voice was steady, fierce. Tom, what did we teach Leo? You don't start fights, but you stand up to bullies, not just for yourself, for the people who can't stand up for themselves. This isn't revenge, it's protection. Her words cut through the haze. She was right. This wasn't about me. It wasn't even about Leo. It was about the Millers. About every neighbor who had ever paid a fine for the wrong color paint or the wrong welcome mat. About people who had been too scared to speak up. So I picked up the phone, and I called Grant. He arrived 10 minutes later, old Salty, the gnome tucked under his arm like a talisman. I laid the papers before him, and for once his usual grin faded. His eyes traced the signatures, the maps, the annexation, his jaw clenched. I knew it, he breathed. I always knew she ran the Millers out, but this, he looked up at me, a new respect in his eyes. This is a smoking gun. I nodded. The question is, how do we use it? Grant leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You can't just hand this over and expect justice tomorrow. Karen's slippery. She'll spin it, bury it, claim it's all a clerical error. The neighbors won't even hear about it until it's too late. I stared at the documents, the weight of truth heavy between us. So what do we do? A slow grin spread across his face. We take it public. The idea hit me like a thunderclap. A public reveal, not in some courtroom months from now, but here in the neighborhood in front of the very people she controlled. We show them what she was, break the spell of fear she cast. The plan came together faster than I expected. Simple, subtle, we'd host a lakeside barbecue, nothing formal, nothing threatening, just burgers, root beer, neighbors talking. But once they were there, once they felt safe, we'd show them the truth, all of it. Grant laughed when I told him. A Trojan horse barbecue, I love it. Lure them in with potato salad, smack them with annexation fraud. He raised old Salty like a sword. You're thinking like a general, Tom. I wasn't a general, but for the first time, I felt like I was leading something bigger than myself. Sarah threw herself into preparations. Gallons of iced tea, plates stacked high, every detail designed to make it look like nothing more than a neighborly get-together. Grant and I made flyers, friendly, cheerful invitations. Lakeside community cookout. All neighbors welcome. We didn't mention Karen. We didn't mention the HOA. We wanted curiosity, not fear. And it worked. The day of the barbecue, cars trickled down the gravel path one by one. At first they came hesitant, unsure. But soon laughter floated over the lake. Children chased each other in the yard. People mingled, talked, ate burgers hot off the grill. And for the first time I saw something I hadn't seen in years, neighbors from deep inside Cypress Creek estates looking relaxed. Free. Like they'd stepped outside her shadow for just one afternoon. I was starting to believe it might actually work. That we might break her grip with nothing more than truth and community. But then the air changed. A pristine white SUV rolled to a stop at the edge of the path. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Karen, clipboard in hand. Her face was a thundercloud, every line of her body vibrating with fury. The chatter died instantly. Hot dogs froze halfway to mouths. A hush swept through the yard as if someone had flipped a switch. That was her power, the ability to silence a crowd just by walking in. She strode down the path like a general inspecting her defeated troops. "What is the meaning of this?" Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. She scanned the crowd, locking eyes on the Cypress Creek residents. "A silent warning, I see you." "This is an unauthorized gathering," she declared, tapping her clipboard. "Mr. Coleman, you are in violation of multiple covenants by canvassing against the association on property adjacent to our community." My hand trembled on the spatula, but I set it down, walked to meet her at the edge of the lawn. My voice was steady when I spoke, but every word carried the weight of all I'd endured. "Karen, this is a private party on my private property. You're trespassing." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. No one talked to Karen like that. Her jaw tightened, but before she could respond, a frail voice broke the silence. "She fined me $200 for a bird bath." An elderly woman stepped forward, her voice shaking but strong. Said it attracted undesirable elements. Then another voice, a burly man, fists clenched. "She made me tear down a 6-foot fence and put up a 5-foot one, cost me $3,000, said the extra foot oppressed the skyline." And just like that, the dam broke. Complaints poured out, fines for the wrong shade of white on trim, threats over children's toys in the yard, citations for vegetable gardens. Each voice rose higher, stronger, feeding the next. And Karen's power, the fear she had spent years building, began to crumble in the sunlight. The crowd was alive now, voices rising like a storm that had been waiting years to break. Each complaint, each painful memory was a spark, and together they lit a fire that Karen couldn't control. She tried, God, she tried. Her voice rose, sharp and shrill, rattling off bylaw numbers and covenant codes. She waved her clipboard like it was a shield, quoting regulations as if words alone could silence the truth spilling out around her. But no one was listening anymore. They weren't looking at her. They were looking at each other, realizing for the first time that they weren't alone, that the punishments, the threats, the fines that had weighed them down weren't just personal vendettas. They were part of a pattern, a system of control. I saw it in their eyes, the fear evaporating, replaced by something stronger. Anger, solidarity. Karen's voice cracked. "Enough, these are isolated incidents, misunderstandings. You all signed covenants. You knew what you were agreeing to." I stepped forward, raising my hands until the crowd fell quiet. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice came out steady, clear. "She does this because she thinks she can get away with it. She counts on each of you being too tired, too scared, too alone to fight back." I turned to face her fully. "But this time she went too far. She tried to have me arrested, on my own property. She fined me for land she doesn't own, and I found out something else." The air thickened. A hush swept across the yard. Every eye locked on me. Karen stiffened, her jaw tightening. "She did the exact same thing 10 years ago, to a family called the Millers." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some of the older residents nodded, their faces shadowed with memory. "She didn't just fine them," I continued. "She annexed their property with fake maps and fraudulent documents. She bullied them until they were forced to sell their home and leave." Karen's face turned white, then red, then white again. She jabbed a finger at me, her voice shrieking. "Lies, slander, you have no proof." I took a breath, let the anticipation hang in the air, and then said, calm as stone, "Don't I?" From the edge of the crowd, an elderly man stepped forward. Frail, leaning on a cane, his steps slow but steady. The neighbors parted like water around him, whispers trailing in his wake. Sarah was beside him, her hand gently steadying his arm. "Everyone," I said, my voice catching in my throat, "this is Mr. Miller." Gasps, shock, and then silence so complete you could hear the wind rustling through the trees. Mr. Miller stopped at the center of the crowd. His voice was thin but carried like a bell. "She's telling the truth," he said, pointing a trembling finger at Karen. "My wife and I loved our home, we planned to die there, but she—" His voice broke, raw with memory. "She made our lives a living hell. Letters, threats, lawyers. My wife's health failed from the stress. We couldn't take it anymore. We had no choice but to sell." The pain in his words cut deeper than any document could. I saw grown men blink back tears. Women shook their heads in disbelief. The neighbors weren't looking at Karen anymore. They were looking at Mr. Miller, and they believed him. Karen stood frozen, her mask shattering. For the first time, she looked small, exposed. She tried to rally. He's confused. He's an old man. This is. But her voice cracked under the weight of 100 eyes staring back at her with anger, with betrayal. The monster had been dragged into the light. Without another word, Karen spun on her heel, marched to her SUV, and slammed the door. Gravel sprayed as she sped away, the crowd's jeers and shouts chasing her down the road. The spell was broken. Neighbors gathered around Mr. Miller, their voices soft, respectful. He looked exhausted but relieved, like a man finally unburdened. He reached into the bag slung over his shoulder and pulled out a dusty cardboard box tied with twine. His hands shook as he passed it to me. "I never threw anything away," he said, his voice thick. "Years of her letters, her notices, her threats, and at the bottom her first mistake." His eyes glistened as he met mine. "Use it, son, make it count." That night after the last car pulled away and the embers of the grill glowed faintly in the dark, Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table. We untied the twine, opened the box, and sifted through the wreckage of someone else's misery. Red ink violation notices, threatening letters from lawyers, copies of falsified surveys. And at the very bottom, a small, cloth-bound ledger, blue cover, gold lettering faded almost to nothing. Cypress Creek Estates HOA Financial Records, Year 1. I almost dismissed it as nothing. Just old numbers, dues, collections, expenses, but Sarah urged me on. Page after page of neat, looping cursive, Karen's handwriting, and then something strange. A separate section tucked in the back. Community Enforcement Fund. Money in, money out, but it wasn't dues, it wasn't maintenance, it was fines. Hundreds of dollars here, thousands there, and the payments going out, not to landscapers or painters, not to neighborhood upkeep, to lawyers, to private investigators, and worst of all, to 2 local businesses, Evergreen Landscaping, Tip Top Roofing, listed again and again as vendor partnership fees. It clicked all at once, like a puzzle falling into place. This wasn't just power, this wasn't just obsession. This was money, a racket. She fined people for lawns, for fences, for roofs, and then she forced them to fix the violations with her approved vendors. And those vendors, they kicked money back into her secret fund. She wasn't just a bully, she was running a criminal enterprise. I stared at the ledger, my hands trembling. Every name, every payment, every kickback, all in her handwriting. Sarah whispered the words I was too stunned to say. "This is organized crime with lawn signs." And she was right. I closed the ledger, my heart pounding in my chest. The barbecue had broken her mask. The Millers had exposed her cruelty. But this ledger was something else entirely. It wasn't just the end of Karen's reign. It was the beginning of her downfall. The ledger sat heavy in my hands, its blue cover glowing faintly under the kitchen light like it carried its own secret fire. Sarah stared at it, her fingers tight around a mug she'd forgotten to drink from. The air between us buzzed with the weight of discovery. This wasn't just fraud anymore. It was racketeering, a kickback scheme hidden in neat cursive stretching back years. I reached for my phone, the number for the state attorney general's office glowing on the screen when headlights swept across the cabin's windows. Too close, too sudden. It wasn't a police cruiser. It was Bob. His sedan crunched up the gravel drive, stopping with a jolt. My stomach sank. He hadn't come here for small talk. I shoved the ledger box under the chair, out of sight. "Stay in the back room," I told Sarah. "If you hear me yell, call 911. My voice was steady, but my pulse was racing so loud I could barely hear myself. A knock at the door, too loud, too forced, a performance like everything else about them. I opened it, my voice flat. "Bob." He stood there, big man, soft around the middle, but carrying himself with that swagger real estate men use when they're trying to close a deal. He tried for a smile, but it sat wrong on his face. "Tom, hey, got a minute? I think we got off on the wrong foot." I didn't move, didn't invite him in. "We're on exactly the foot you and your wife chose." His smile cracked. He glanced past me into the cabin. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "Karen, she gets enthusiastic. She pushes too hard sometimes, but her heart's in the right place. She just wants the community to look nice." "Is that what you call it?" I shot back. "Enthusiasm, having me arrested, harassing an entire neighborhood, forcing old folks out of their homes." His eyes narrowed, the friendly mask slipped and the predator beneath it showed. "You don't understand," he growled. "You're playing with fire, Tom. You're messing with things better left alone. This crusade of yours, it needs to stop." He stepped closer, his size meant to intimidate, his breath hot with anger. "Let me make this simple. These fines, these problems, they can all go away. You drop this. You stop talking to people. You forget the Millers ever existed, and we go back to being neighbors." It was a threat dressed as an offer. And for the first time, I almost laughed. They were scared. The barbecue had worked better than I ever imagined. They felt the ground shifting under their feet, and Bob was here trying to shove it back in place with his bulk and his bluster. I thought of Leo, of the promise I'd made to him, of Mr. Miller's trembling voice. The line between right and wrong had never been clearer. "No," I said, quiet but absolute. "It's not going to stop. In fact, it's just getting started." A flicker of panic crossed his eyes, but it vanished quick, replaced by fury. "You stupid man," he hissed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Nice little place you've got here. Old wood, lots of history. It'd be a real shame if something happened to it. A fire, maybe. These cabins go up so fast." The words hung in the air like poison. He had just crossed the line from intimidation to threat. And something cold and dangerous settled in me. "I know you notarized it, Bob," I said, my voice steady as steel. He froze. "I know you used your seal to legitimize a fraudulent annexation. That's a felony. And I know about evergreen landscaping, tip-top roofing, the slush fund." His face went pale, all the bluster drained out in an instant. He looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't solid at all. And then his eyes darted, past me, to the corner of the room where the ledger box peeked out from behind the chair. He lunged. It was clumsy, desperate. He shoved past me, reaching for the box. But I'd spent years hauling heavy loads, steady on my feet. I sidestepped, and his momentum carried him headfirst into the bookshelf. The shelf crashed down, showering him with Leo's old baseball trophies. Plastic players frozen mid-swing, marble bases clattering like thunder. And then the door burst open. Tom, Grant, wide-eyed, hair wild, charging in with old Salty, the gnome raised over his head like a battle axe. "I saw his car. What's going on?" Chaos exploded. A large, panicked man scrambling under a rain of trophies. A retired mailman brandishing a ceramic fisherman. Bob scrambled to his feet, terror etched across his face. He knocked over a lamp, glass shattering, and bolted out the door. Tires screeched, gravel flew, and then he was gone. "Silence." Grant lowered old Salty, breathing hard. "Did we get him?" he asked, chest heaving, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. I stared at the wreckage, the fallen shelf, the scattered trophies, the ledger box safe by my chair, and for the first time I felt it. "We had them." The next morning the phone rang. A woman's voice, crisp and professional. "Mr. Coleman? This is Investigator Ramirez from the State Attorney General's office. We've reviewed your submission. We are serving a warrant at the home of Robert and Karen Peters this morning. We'd like you to be present on site to help identify documents." I gripped the receiver tight, my pulse thundering. After weeks of humiliation, threats, and fear, the tide had finally turned. And by the end of that day, the empire of Karen Peters would be nothing but rubble. The morning air was sharp, crisp, the kind that cuts right through your lungs and makes you feel awake whether you want to be or not. I stood across the street from Karen's immaculate home, Sarah's hand steady on my arm as the cavalry finally arrived. Black SUVs, unmarked sedans, and men and women in jackets with state investigator stamped across the back. They moved with purpose, no hesitation, no clipboard theatrics. The neighbors trickled out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. Some stood in clusters, whispering. Others lingered at the edges of their lawns, pretending to rake or fetch mail, but their eyes never left the scene. And right there beside me, like he'd been waiting for this moment his whole life, stood Grant, with old Salty the gnome tucked under his arm like a proud battle trophy. "Front row seats," he muttered, his grin barely contained. "Didn't think I'd live to see the Queen lose her crown." We watched as investigators carried box after box out of the Peters' pristine white palace. Laptops, files, binders, all the evidence of a decade of control and corruption stacked like bricks of guilt on the curb. Every slam of a car trunk echoed like a gavel. Then the door opened. Karen stepped out first. Her face was pale, twisted with disbelief. She looked around at the crowd of neighbors, searching for sympathy, for fear, for anything she could still twist into control. But what she found was silence, cold, watching eyes, and when her gaze landed on me across the street, her expression contorted into pure hatred. Her lips moved, but no sound came. For the first time, her glare had no power. Behind her came Bob, shoulders slumped, head down, the swagger gone. He looked smaller somehow, like all the hot air had been sucked out of him. He shuffled to the car, the weight of his own choices pressing down on his back. 2 separate unmarked cars, 2 slamming doors, and just like that, it was over. A murmur spread through the crowd, not relief exactly, not joy, but something deeper. The kind of silence that comes after a storm when you realize the worst has passed, but the damage is still there. Neighbors leaned toward one another, whispering. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled. Small, tentative, but real. Grant broke the silence first. He raised Old Salty high over his head and shouted, "The witch is gone!" The laughter that followed wasn't just humor, it was release. The tightness that had lived in these people's shoulders for years seemed to ease all at once. Sarah squeezed my hand, her voice low but certain. "It's done, Tom. You did it." But I knew this wasn't just me. It was all of us. The barbecue, the Millers, the neighbors who finally found their voices. The truth had spread, and the state investigators had simply nailed the coffin shut. The weeks that followed were a blur. The case unspooled like a bad novel, every chapter worse than the last. Fraudulent annexations, kickbacks from vendors, a slush fund built on fear and intimidation. Faced with irrefutable evidence, other board members cracked, offering testimony in exchange for leniency. Even the landscaping and roofing companies spilled, their shady deals laid bare. The court moved swiftly, too swiftly for Karen to claw her way out. The Cypress Creek Estates HOA was dissolved by order of the court. Its accounts were seized, including the slush fund. A court-appointed administrator repaid every homeowner who had been bled dry by bogus fines. And one by one, the fraudulent annexations were overturned, property lines restored. Mr. Miller, frail, tired, but alive, received a settlement big enough to live out his remaining years in peace. For him, it wasn't about the money. It was about vindication. Proof that he hadn't been crazy, that the nightmare he and his wife endured was real, and that it was over. The community was free. I should have felt victorious, and in a way I did. But standing on my cabin porch in the quiet of autumn, I felt something deeper, relief. The peace I had wanted all along. The lake shimmered in the evening light, the air cool with the smell of fallen leaves. Sarah sat beside me, her head on my shoulder. For the first time in weeks, there were no sirens, no letters tucked under windshield wipers, no threats disguised as neighborly visits. Just peace. But the story didn't end with court rulings or settlements. It ended in a letter. The envelope arrived with military stamps, worn from its journey overseas. I unfolded the paper, my son's handwriting sprawled across the page. "Dad, I read your email 3 times. I can't believe it. You took on a whole army of Karens. I always knew you were tough, but I didn't know you were that tough. You're my hero. I'm so proud of you. Keep my guitar safe." The words blurred as my eyes filled. I folded the letter and tucked it into my pocket, close to my heart. The question that had haunted me, how far will a man go to defend his own, finally had its answer. He'll go all the way. He'll dig through dusty records. He'll rally neighbors. He'll face down threats, even fires whispered in the dark. And he'll stand shoulder to shoulder with a mailman wielding a garden gnome if that's what it takes. Because in the end, it wasn't just about my son or my cabin or my family. It was about something bigger, something simple but powerful. No one should have the right to steal your peace. And we took ours back. Justice doesn't thunder like in the movies. It doesn't come with triumphant music or flashing headlines. It arrives slowly, piece by piece, like dawn breaking through a long night. For weeks after the raid, Cypress Creek Estates felt like a town waking from a bad dream. The fear that had been stitched into the sidewalks and hedges began to unravel. People started leaving toys in their yards again. Holiday lights went up early. Neighbors waved at each other without glancing over their shoulders first. I walked those streets sometimes, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see the change with my own eyes. The same homes that once looked suffocated now looked alive. You could hear laughter from porches, smell barbecue smoke drifting over fences. It was subtle, but it was freedom. The court's ruling had been decisive. The HOA was dissolved, its bank accounts seized. Every fine that had been wrung out of these families was refunded down to the penny. For some, it was thousands. For others, it was the simple relief of a lien lifted from their deed. But for everyone, it was proof that they weren't crazy, that they hadn't been alone. And Karen. She and Bob faced charges that made the evening news. Fraud, conspiracy, abuse of authority. Her face, The same face that had once struck fear into an entire neighborhood was now shown under the harsh fluorescent lights of a booking photo. The clipboard queen had been dethroned, her empire reduced to evidence boxes and court transcripts. Neighbors who once whispered about her behind closed doors now spoke openly, freely. "She fined me for having a garden gnome," one man told a reporter, shaking his head with disbelief. "Guess she didn't know gnomes fight back." He winked at Grant, who puffed up like a proud soldier, Old Salty cradled under his arm like a war medal. Grant had become something of a legend after the barbecue and the cabin confrontation. Kids in the neighborhood started drawing chalk gnomes on the sidewalk, calling them Salty's Army. He grinned whenever he saw them, his pride only slightly tempered by the fact that his gnome had become a folk hero. Mr. Miller, though, his victory was quieter. He moved a little easier now, his shoulders less burdened. When the settlement came through, he used part of it to set up a scholarship in his late wife's name for local kids who wanted to study horticulture. "She loved her roses," he told me one afternoon, tears shining in his eyes. "Now her garden will live on even if she's gone." I felt something settle inside me when he said that. It wasn't just justice, it was restoration. And at the cabin, the place where this all began, the peace I had longed for finally returned. The nights were quiet again, filled with the sound of crickets instead of sirens. Leo's guitar sat in the corner, untouched but safe, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch with Sarah, root beer in hand, and just listen to the water lapping against the shore. After so much noise, silence had become sacred. One evening, Grant ambled down the path, Salty under his arm as always. He plopped himself onto the porch step and let out a sigh. "You know, Tom," he said, staring at the lake, "most men go fishing for peace. You went to war for it." I chuckled, shaking my head. Didn't feel much like peace in the middle of it. He sipped his root beer, eyes twinkling. "Maybe not, but you gave people their lives back. That's more than peace, that's freedom." The word stuck with me. Freedom. Not the kind you read in history books, but the kind that lives in the everyday. Being able to plant roses without fear, hang Christmas lights without a citation, keep a bird bath without a letter in the mail. It struck me that this fight, as messy as it was, wasn't about tearing something down. It was about giving people that kind of freedom back. And in the end, maybe that was what made it worth it. I wrote to Leo about it all, every detail. From the flashing lights on the night Karen called 911, to the barbecue, to the ledger and the raid. When his reply came weeks later, I read it 3 times. "Dad, you fought your war here while I fought mine overseas. I'm proud of you. You didn't just protect my things, you protected our home, our family. And you showed everyone that no matter how strong a bully seems, the truth is stronger. I hope I can fight my battles the way you fought yours." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the same pocket I kept his first one. His words were more than pride. They were a reminder that sometimes standing up to bullies in our neighborhoods takes the same courage as standing up to enemies overseas. Different uniforms, same principle. That night, Sarah leaned against me on the porch, the stars bright over the lake. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it." And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. The seasons turned quietly after that. Summer slipped into fall, the air sharpening, the lake mirroring the red and gold of the trees. Life settled back into something that finally felt normal. But normal had a new weight, a new depth. Because once you've stood on the edge, once you've looked a bully dead in the eye and refused to move, you can never quite go back to who you were before. At the cabin, peace lived in the details. The creak of the porch swing, the smell of cedar and pine drifting through the windows, the soft strum of Leo's guitar when I picked it up, my fingers stumbling across chords I barely remembered, the sound filling the empty room like a promise. Every item I had carried here, the boxes, the records, the lava lamp, had become more than just things. They were proof that I'd kept my word to my son, proof that some battles are worth every bruise. One evening, as the sun slipped low over the water, I pulled out his latest letter. The paper was thin, worn from its journey halfway across the world. His handwriting was rushed, uneven, but clear. "Dad, I still can't believe it. You didn't just hold the line, you pushed it back. You didn't let her win. I bragged to my unit about you. Told them my old man took down a whole HOA while we were over here. They laughed, but they called you a legend. And you are, keep my guitar safe. I'll be home soon." I read it 3 times, the words soaking into me like sunlight after rain. I folded the letter and slid it into my pocket, close to where I kept the first one. Between them, I carried both the weight of his absence and the strength of his belief in me. That night, Sarah and I sat on the porch together. The fireflies blinked across the yard, the lake whispered against the shore. She rested her head on my shoulder and we didn't need to speak, because some silences are heavier than words. Some silences are victory. But victory, I realized, wasn't loud. It wasn't about the warrants or the arrests or the boxes of evidence. It was about something much simpler. It was about the neighbors now free to live without fear. It was about Mr. Miller, finally vindicated, planting roses in memory of his wife. It was about the children running barefoot across lawns without their parents worrying about letters in the mail. And yes, it was about me, a father who had promised his son that his memories would be safe. A man who had once lived quietly, avoiding trouble, only to learn that sometimes trouble finds you, and when it does, you either bow to it or you stand. The question had haunted me from the beginning. How far will a man go to defend his own? Now I knew. He'll go all the way. He'll face down sirens on his own porch. He'll endure the humiliation of false accusations. He'll dig through dusty records in forgotten offices. He'll stand in front of neighbors and pull secrets into the light. He'll take threats meant to break him and turn them into fuel. And yes, if it comes to it, he'll stand beside a retired mailman wielding a garden gnome, because when you're fighting for what matters, you don't choose your allies, you accept them with gratitude. And in the end, it wasn't just about my son. It wasn't just about my cabin. It wasn't even about me. It was about peace. The kind of peace no one has the right to steal. Karen and Bob had tried. They built their empire on fear, on lies, on the quiet suffering of people too tired to resist. But when fear breaks, when truth is dragged into the light, bullies crumble. And they did. The lake was still that night, the stars sharp and endless above it. I thought of Leo, of his words, of the way he'd said, "You're my hero." And for once, I let myself believe it. Not because I was stronger than anyone else, not because I was braver, but because I refused to give in when it mattered most. And maybe that's all a hero really is. Someone who refuses to surrender their peace. Someone who defends it, not just for themselves, but for everyone who can't. I leaned back in the porch chair, Sarah's hand warm in mine, the sound of crickets rising like a hymn. The fight was over. The peace was ours again. And it had never felt so good. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.